Okay, Jen the Liberty Lion, and we're talking about Lecture 3 in Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. And we're starting now on page 6. We did page 1 through 5 in Lecture 3, Part 1. Now we're at Lecture 3, Part 2, and we'll be starting on page 6. Austin continues. Of course, it will be evident that it is comparatively simple if we never admit to any such procedure at all. That is, any procedure at all for doing that sort of thing, or that procedure at all for doing that sort of way of doing a particular thing. But equally possible are the cases where we do some things in certain circumstances or in certain hands accept a procedure, but not in any other circumstances or at other hands. And there we may often be in doubt, as in the naming example above, whether an infelicity should be brought into our present class Alpha 1, or rather into Alpha 2, or even Beta 1 or Beta 2. For example, at a party, you say, when picking sides, I pick George. George grunts. I'm not playing. Has George been picked? Undoubtedly, the situation is an unhappy one. Well, we may say, you have not picked George, whether because there is no convention that you can pick people who aren't playing, or because George, in the circumstances, is an inappropriate object for the procedure of picking. Inappropriate object for the procedure of picking. So they can pick somebody, but if the person's outside their authority, he's not picked. Okay, so he says, on a desert island, you may say to me, go and pick up wood. And I may say, I don't take orders from you. Or, you're not entitled to give me orders. I do not take orders from you when you try to assert your authority, which I might fall in with, but I might not, on a desert island, as opposed to the case when you are the captain on a ship and therefore genuinely have authority. So here's my note. Just like a captain of a ship has authority on the ship, once it docks and people get off the ship, the captain no longer has authority over them. If the ship crashes on a desert island, the captain is not in charge of the people. He may pretend to be in charge, since it may be desirable to create an aura of control in order to avoid chaos, but the captain does not in fact have authority over anyone. The captain only has authority on the ship. The same is said when someone is elected into an office created by the Constitution, but does not meet the actual qualifications of that office. That person has no real authority. His acts are void. It is an infelicity called a misfire, and it is void. Those are my notes there. Now Austin continues. Now we could say, bringing the case under Alpha 2, misapplication, the procedure, uttering certain words, etc., was okay and accepted, but the circumstances in which it was invoked or the persons who invoked it were wrong. That's what I'm telling you guys. The people in Congress right now using the Constitution and its power to wield power over the entire country are the wrong people. They don't meet the qualifications. They have no authority. Everything they do is void. I pick is only in order when we object, when the object of the verb is a player. And a command is in order only when the subject of the verb is a commander or an authority. He's getting into grammar here. I don't really think it's important to pay attention too much to that. I do like reading it, and there's some of that also mentioned in the other book by Ayer, some grammar problems with English. But if you hear me talking about the object of the verb and so on, and the subject and so on and so forth. Don't really concern yourself with that too much, okay? You're going to get the bigger picture. He says, or again, we should say, bringing the case under Rule Beta 2, and perhaps we should reduce the former suggestion to this. The procedure has not been completely executed. My note is such as in the case of the laws being passed that have never been given a positive law citation, and so they're not laws because the procedure's not been followed, or it doesn't meet the requirements and it's not a constitutional thing that they're doing. They're not doing it in a constitutional way. So if the people in office are doing things not in a constitutional way, what authority do they have to do them? None. And what authority do they have to do anything, even if it is constitutional, if they're not the right people for the office? And if they are the right people for the office, but they don't have authority over the people of the states, why are they pretending to pass laws for people of the states that they have no authority over? Because if they're part of the Constitution and they meet the constitutional qualifications, they are federal citizens, meaning they have a military background, and so they can't order any civilian anything unless it's to keep the peace. So we're in a cycle here, and once you get it, it makes sense. And then you can see, oh, they don't have any authority. Either they do or they don't. Either they are or they aren't. And either way, if they were, they still don't. And if they're not, then they definitely don't. Okay, so he says, or again, we should say, bringing the case under Rule Beta 2, and perhaps we should reduce the former suggestion to this. The procedure has not been completely executed because it is a necessary part of it that, say, the person to be the object of the verb I order to must, by some previous procedure, tacit or verbal, have first constituted the person to be the object of the verb I order to. Must, by some previous procedure, tacit or verbal, have first okay, that's redundant. I said this again by accident. Okay, I promise to you, this is, of course, one of the uncertainties, and purely general one, really, which underlie the debate when we discuss in political theory whether there is or is not or should be a social contract. So it's not just an argument of whether there is or is not, but also should there even be one, a social contract. He continues, it appears to me that it does not matter in principle at all how we decide in particular cases, though we may agree either on the facts or by introducing further definitions to prefer one solution rather than another, but it is important in principle to be clear. 1, as against Beta 2, that however much we take into the procedure, it should still be possible for someone to reject all of it. Okay, here's my note. Now he talks about procedures set into place. The procedure has to be accepted, just like the courts have a procedure for performing its duties, and the people who come into it should know and understand the procedures, and they should all accept it. We already have procedures. Recently, we've been seeing that the judge will talk to the juries and tell them what the procedures are, but those aren't widely accepted procedures. It's just something that the judge has decided to say. In the United States, I continue, in the United States, that is the federal government, the procedure is commonly referred to as the promulgation of laws in 1 U.S.C. 106A. Quote, whenever a bill, order, resolution, or vote of the Senate and House of Representatives having been approved by the President or not having been returned to him with his objections becomes a law or takes effect, it shall forthwith be received by the Archivist of the United States from the President, and whenever a bill, order, resolution, so this is a procedure. The procedure is outlined in 1 U.S.C. 106A. Now, this is just an example of the procedures that have to be followed for passing a law. There's many other parts of this too. Okay, and let's see. There are other proper procedures or performatives that must be done, such as how acts are titled, what the enacting clause should look like, how sections are numbered, so on and so forth. These are found in Title I, which has a positive law citation. The taking of the oath is a procedure to taking office, okay? And then Austin continues with number 2. that for a procedure to be accepted involves more than for it merely to be the case that it is in fact generally used, even actually by the persons now concerned, and that it must remain in principle open for anyone to reject any procedure or code of procedures, even one that has already hitherto accepted, as may happen with, for example, the code of honor. One who does so is, of course, liable to sanctions. Others refuse to play with him or say that he is a man of honor. Above all must not be put into flat factual circumstances, for this is subject to the old objection to deriving an ought from an is. Being accepted is not a circumstance in the right sense. With many procedures, for example, playing games, however appropriate the circumstances may be, I may still not be playing. And further, we should contend that in the last resort, it is doubtful of being accepted is definable as being usually employed. But this is a more difficult matter. Secondly, what could be meant by the suggestion that sometimes a procedure may not even exist, as distinct from the question whether it is accepted, and by this or that group or not? And there's a footnote here. It says, if we object here to saying that there is doubt whether it exists, as well we may, for the word gives us currently fashionable creeps, which are in general undoubtedly legitimate, we might say that the doubt is rather as to the precise nature or definition or comprehension of the procedure, which undoubtedly does exist and is accepted. My notes are: some procedures do not have to be in writing. Some are ancient and are well known, or at least they were well known. One of the parts of ancient lawful procedure is that the law cannot compel a man to perform an impossibility. That means they cannot go against nature, that man cannot be forced to act at his own peril or detriment. Giving up your arms is an act at your own peril. It is an act forced upon you to act against yourself. To have your speech controlled is to act at your own peril, because you speaking out against government is one of the ways in which government is controlled. An out of control government is detrimental to the people who institute it. So if you don't speak out, you're acting to your own detriment. If you're forced not to speak out and told you can't speak out, you are forced to act against yourself. So you're being refused your right to self-defense when you're refused your right to speak or carry arms, and so on and so forth. You could say that part of the procedure or part of the right to freedom or a republican state form of government is the right to perform the act of speaking freely. They go hand in hand, and you cannot have one without the other. Austin says, we have the case of procedures which no longer exist, merely in the sense that though once generally accepted, they are no longer generally accepted or even accepted by anybody. For example, the case of challenging. So my notes is a case of a procedure that no longer lists. So of course we have medical procedures that are no longer in use. Leeching, lobotomy. We have burning witches. We don't do that anymore. Citizens used to hold their governments accountable by performing citizen investigations of servants and their contracts and actions. Today, the servants basically investigate themselves. This has been a long process of changing things. So this idea that the citizens are no longer allowed to investigate government, that government will just investigate itself, this has taken a long time for them to do. They forced it on us. When the citizens tried to institute their citizen grand juries, they went through a whole lot of problems with, fighting the government for for this right to keep government under control, which the government then just went against people and decided they would institute all these police departments to do their own. So the police really were the people. But now the police take an oath to the federal Constitution and they work for the Federal Reserve Bank. So I'm sure you can think of more of these on your own. Okay, one more page, one and a half or so more pages, and we'll go to part 3. So Austin says we have even the case of procedures which someone is initiating. Sometimes he may get away with it, like in football, the man who first picked up the ball and ran. Getting away with things is essential, despite the suspicious terminology, considering a possible case to say you were cowardly, maybe to reprimand you or to insult you, or I can make my performance explicit by saying I insult you. The reasons for this do not matter here. Footnote 2, many such possible procedures and formulas would be disadvantageous if recognized. That's interesting. Many such possible procedures and formulas would be disadvantageous if recognized. For example, perhaps we ought not to allow the formula, I promise you that I'll thrash you. But I am told that in the heyday of student dueling in Germany, it was the custom for members of one club to arch past members of a rival club, each drawn up in file, and then for each to say to his chosen opponent as he passed, quite politely, Beleidigung, which means I insult you. All that does matter is that a special variety of non-play was at one time Austin's name for the category Alpha 1 of infelicities. He later rejected it, but it remains in his notes at this point. So the non-play can arise if someone does say, I insult you, for while insulting is a conventional procedure and indeed primarily a verbal one, so that in a way we cannot help understanding the procedure that someone who says I insult you is purporting to invoke, yet we are bound to non-play him, not merely because the convention is not accepted, but because we vaguely feel the presence of some bar, the nature of which is not immediately clear, against its ever being accepted. Okay, next we talk about baptizing a dog. Austin says much more common, however, will be cases where it is uncertain how far a procedure extends, which cases it covers, or which varieties it could be made to cover. Of course, he simplifies these, such as baptizing a dog. I say we might think about the law when it states any individual, all persons, any persons, all corporations, any legal entity born alive, where a lot of people state they are forced to follow the laws using these words because they use the words. So that's like saying God exists because God exists. Well, you're saying that you're an individual in your mind, and so when you see it in the law, you're saying, well, that's me, and so I have to do it. But really, there was no authority for them to include you in that because you have a different status than the people that they have actual authority over. Okay, so you understand that? It's because they use these words, but that's not always the case because the people making the law have no actual authority over those they make the law for. So the law might say all, any, person, individual, born alive, entity, and so on. But that does not mean that includes all of us. It would only include those people that the law has actual authority over. You can play along if you want. Not pretend authority. So, for example, the president, who is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, can only order the armed forces, but when he speaks as commander-in-chief, he is only speaking to those people in the military or the militia when called into actual service. He cannot order, as the commander-in-chief, any citizen at any time ever in any way who is not in the military or militia and called into the actual service. When he is making a statement such as the executive officer of the United States of America, he's speaking to the state governors and possibly the legislators. He can capture the governors of the states if they do not understand the Constitution. For example, if he acts as though he can order them as commander-in-chief of the military and the militia, and the governor takes an oath and the governor is confused as to what the oath is and what the Constitution means and what America is and what the United States is, the governor may think he has to take orders from the president. But as the executive officer, it is the duty of the president of the United States not to order the governors of the states. The state governors do not take orders from the president. It is the state's job, in my opinion, to keep the president in line by not allowing him to step outside his authority. Lincoln stepped outside his authority, and since then America and the states and the people have been in turmoil. The military has taken over. Corporations are registered as doing business with the United States. State citizens claim to be federal citizens, which they are in reality not and never were intended to be. But these are just examples of what has occurred and how the authority to do a thing has expanded, such as baptizing a dog. The applicability of the Constitution has been expanded way and far beyond its boundaries. The people in constitutional offices act outside their constitutional authorities, and most, I believe, have no authority at all because they do not qualify for those positions. Okay, looking at the clock here. It is inherent. Let's see, we're at 21. Let's go ahead and call this number 2. I think we're in number 2, and then I'll go ahead and start on